The heavy air of a Thursday afternoon hung over the central square like an invisible shroud. The merciless sun beat down, making the asphalt shimmer like molten glass, while few souls dared to cross this small urban oasis, hemmed in by commercial and residential buildings. It was one of those afternoons where time seemed suspended, each second dragging on with the slowness of a tear rolling down a weary face. On a worn wooden bench, under the sparse shade of a century-old oak, sat a man who seemed to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders. His neatly combed gray hair, despite the adverse circumstances, revealed a dignity that refused to yield. His hands, etched by time and labor, held a yellowed envelope with the delicacy of someone handling something sacred. His suit, once elegant, now showed signs of wear, not from neglect, but from the relentless passage of years and the scarcity that had become his silent companion. Frank was 72 years old, with a story few knew. He had been a literature professor for 4 decades, shaping young minds with the same passion a sculptor molds marble. His eyes, still bright despite his age, held the intensity of someone who had dedicated their entire life to knowledge and the education of generations. Now retired for 5 years, he lived on a modest pension that barely covered his basic needs. The envelope in his hands contained his work papers and some documents. He was there waiting for an interview for a part-time job at a small stationery store in the area. The irony of the situation didn't escape him. A man who had spent his life teaching about human dignity through the classics now found himself forced to compete for a position that would barely pay his monthly expenses. But Frank wasn't the type to succumb to despair. There was an ancestral calm in his gestures, a serenity born from decades of facing adversity with his head held high. Next to him on the bench, a young woman nervously flipped through a book, occasionally glancing discreetly in his direction. She seemed intrigued by the impeccable posture of the elderly man, the way he observed the square's activity with genuine interest, as if each person passing by were a character worthy of a novel. What she didn't know was that Frank had always been like this, an observer of human nature, someone who found beauty and meaning even in the most mundane scenarios. Across the square, near the bus stop, a group of young office workers from nearby companies enjoyed their lunch break. Amidst loud laughter and carefree conversations, they seemed to inhabit a world completely different from the man on the bench. There was no malice in their joy, only the natural unawareness of youth that had not yet been touched by life's true hardships. To them, old age was a distant and abstract reality, something that happened to other people in other times. Then something happened that would change the course of that seemingly ordinary afternoon. One of the young men, discarding a used napkin, missed the trash can by a few feet. The paper flew in the wind and landed at Frank's feet. The young man, realizing what had happened, looked in the direction of the elderly man, and for a moment their eyes met. There was a simple opportunity for human connection. All it would take was to cross the few feet separating them, apologize, and pick up the trash. But the young man hesitated, looked at his friends chatting animatedly, and chose the easy path he pretended not to see. Frank observed the whole scene in silence, without haste, without visible indignation. He slowly bent down and picked up the paper, depositing it in the nearest trash can. His movements were deliberate, not from coldness, but from the awareness that small gestures of civility shouldn't depend on recognition. The young woman next to him witnessed everything and felt a pang of discomfort, not because of what Frank had done, but because of the young office worker's attitude. The minutes crawled by, and Frank discreetly checked an old wristwatch, an heirloom from his father. He still had 20 minutes until his interview at the stationery store. 20 minutes he would spend observing life unfold around him, without haste, without apparent anxiety. There was something almost meditative in the way he inhabited that moment, as if he had learned, over so many years, that patience is one of humanity's most underrated virtues. Then a figure appeared in the square that would catch the eye of any attentive observer. It was a woman of about 50, wearing a discreet but impeccable city sanitation uniform. Her hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and she carried a broom and a small cart with cleaning supplies. Unlike many workers who perform their tasks mechanically, She seemed genuinely interested in keeping this public space clean and pleasant. Marina had worked in urban cleaning for over 15 years. She knew every corner of that square, every bench, every tree. She saw people come and go, observed silent dramas and small everyday joys. Over the years, she had developed a kind of sixth sense for noticing when someone needed a kind gesture or simply acknowledgement. And that afternoon, her experienced eyes immediately noticed Frank. It wasn't just the way he was dressed or the care with which he handled his documents, it was something more subtle, the posture of someone who maintains dignity even when circumstances are unfavorable. Marina recognized this posture because she had cultivated it in herself during all those years of work. She knew that there is a silent strength in those who refuse to let external difficulties alter their inner essence. While cleaning the area near the bench where Frank was sitting, Marina noticed other details that would escape less observant eyes. The way he had carefully folded a tissue before putting it in his pocket, the way he watched a child playing near the fountain with a subtle but genuine smile, the patience with which he waited, without showing anxiety or impatience, even though it was obvious he was there for an important appointment. It was then that Marina witnessed the napkin scene. She saw the young man throw the paper, saw it land at Frank's feet, witnessed the moment of hesitation and the decision to pretend not to have seen it. She watched Frank pick up the trash naturally, without resentment, without theatrics. And it was at that moment that something ignited within her, not indignation but a silent determination that that afternoon would not end like that. The young employees, oblivious to what had happened, continued their lively conversation. They talked about weekend plans, complained about bosses, shared memes on their phones. They were normal people, not malicious, just disconnected from the reality around them. In their individual bubbles, they couldn't see the impact of their small actions, or the lack thereof. Marina finished cleaning the area around the bench and walked over to the group of young people. Her approach was natural, part of the park's cleaning routine. But when she got close to them, her voice softly cut through the lively conversation. "Excuse me," she said, with a politeness that came from the heart, not protocol. "Did you see that gentleman over there on the bench?" The young people turned in the direction indicated by Marina. Frank remained seated, now reading something in one of the documents he was carrying. "Yes," one of them replied, not understanding where the conversation was leading. Marina smiled, not a condescending or punitive smile, but something genuinely warm. "That man there is Professor Frank. For 40 years he taught literature at one of the city's most important schools. He trained doctors, engineers, lawyers, teachers. Many of the professionals you know probably passed through his hands." There was something in Marina's voice that made people pay attention. It wasn't authoritarian or preachy, but it carried an authenticity that was impossible to ignore. "He's here waiting for a job interview," she continued, "because at 72, even after a lifetime dedicated to education, he still needs to work to supplement his income. And a few minutes ago, when you threw a piece of paper that landed at his feet, he got up and picked it up, even though it wasn't his responsibility." The silence that followed was eloquent. It wasn't an embarrassing or accusatory silence, but a reflective one. Marina had planted a seed of conscience without using a single word of reproach. "I've worked here for 15 years, she continued, "and I see many things. I see people who go through life without noticing other people. And I see people like Professor Frank, who even when facing their own difficulties, still find the strength to take care of the world around them." One of the young people, a girl with curly hair, who had been quieter during the previous conversation, stood out from the group. Without saying a word, she walked over to Frank. The others followed her with their eyes, curious about what would happen next. The young woman approached the bench with deliberate but respectful steps. Frank lifted his eyes from the documents and looked at her with a gentle and curious expression. "Professor," she said, "my name is Anna. We would like to apologize for what happened a little while ago, and we'd love to know more about your story." Frank tilted his head, intrigued. "I don't understand, young lady." Anna sat down next to him, with the naturalness of someone who had been raised to respect her elder. The cleaning lady told us that you were a professor for many years, and she made us realize, well, that maybe we're not paying enough attention to the people around us. It was then that something magical happened. The other young people timidly approached, forming a small semicircle around the bench. Frank, surprised but touched by the genuine interest, began to talk about his career, about the students he had met, about the importance of education in transforming people. And here, allow me to pause this story to share something important with you who are following this narrative. Stories like this, which remind us of the importance of empathy and human connection, are exactly the type of content I share regularly on this channel. If you are feeling this emotional connection with the story of Professor Frank and Marina, if you are wondering how small gestures can transform the world around us, then this is the right place for you. By subscribing and activating the bell, you will not only receive notifications about new inspiring stories like this, but you will also join a community of people who believe in the transformative power of kindness and mutual respect. Each subscriber is someone who chooses to see the world with more humor, and this collective energy is what allows us to continue creating content that truly matters. Your presence here makes all the difference. Returning to our story, as Frank spoke, something extraordinary was happening. His words, chosen with the care of someone who had spent decades honing the art of communication, began to weave an invisible web of connection between all those people. He talked about shy students who discovered their voice through poetry, about rebellious youngsters who found direction through great novels, about how literature had the power to expand horizons and cultivate empathy. The young woman who had started the conversation revealed that she had a degree in journalism and had always been interested in human stories. One of the young men mentioned that his grandmother had been a teacher and that he had always admired her dedication to the profession. Another talked about how a teacher had changed his perspective on life at a crucial moment in his adolescence. Marina, who had been the catalyst for this transformation, continued her cleaning nearby, a subtle smile playing on her lips. She knew she had witnessed something special, the moment strangers become real people to each other, when the invisible barriers of age, social class, and circumstance dissolve in the face of shared humanity. Frank, in turn, felt a warmth he hadn't experienced in months. It wasn't just the interest shown by these young people, but the remembrance of why he had chosen to be a teacher in the first place. It was precisely this, the possibility of connecting people with ideas, of opening minds to new perspectives, of planting seeds of reflection that could blossom years later. When it was finally time for his interview, Frank stood up with renewed energy. The young people said goodbye with warm hugs and promises to stay in touch. Anna handed him her business card, saying she'd love to write a story about his career as an educator. Another young person mentioned working at a small publishing house, and that there might be opportunities for someone with his experience. But the real transformation wasn't in these concrete possibilities. It was in the shift in perspective that had occurred in everyone present. The young people returned to work, carrying a new awareness of the people around them, of how each individual carries a rich and complex story deserving of respect and attention. Frank walked to the stationery store with lighter steps. The interview, when it finally happened, went surprisingly well. The store owner, a middle-aged man who had studied at one of the schools where Frank had taught, recognized him immediately. He not only offered him the job, but proposed something even better, that Frank coordinate a small book club that would meet on Saturday afternoons in the back of the stationery store. Marina finished her shift that afternoon with a deep sense of satisfaction. She had witnessed and facilitated a small, everyday miracle, the kind of quiet transformation that rarely makes headlines, but which is perhaps the most important kind of change there is. When she got home, she told her husband what had happened, and he smiled, knowing well his wife's generous nature. The days that followed brought subtle but significant changes for everyone involved. Anna, the young journalist, did indeed write an article about Frank that was published in the local newspaper. The article, titled The Teacher Who Never Stopped Teaching, touched the hearts of many readers and generated a wave of recognition for retired educators in the region. The book club at the stationery store became an unexpected success. Frank discovered he still had much to offer, and the participants, an eclectic mix of ages and backgrounds, found in those weekly meetings something they didn't know they were looking for, a community based on a shared love of literature and reflection. But perhaps the most profound change happened in the group of young employees. They began to pay more attention to the people around them, to recognize the humanity in faces that had previously gone unnoticed. Anna volunteered for an adult literacy program. Another member of the group began to regularly visit a nursing home, simply to chat with the residents. Marina continued her work in the square, but now with a renewed certainty that her role went far beyond physical cleaning. She was, in her own way, a guardian of human dignity in that small urban space. Her discreet but impactful interventions became a trademark, and many frequenters of the square began to seek her out, not only for practical information, but for advice and a friendly word. Months later, on an afternoon very similar to that Thursday that had changed everything, Frank was again sitting on the same bench, but now he wasn't alone. He was accompanied by some members of the book club, discussing the themes of a novel they had just finished. Anna was there, not as a journalist, but as a regular participant in the meetings. Marina, making her usual cleaning rounds, stopped to greet the group. There was something deeply satisfying about seeing that scene, people of different generations and backgrounds, united by the pleasure of intelligent conversation and genuine human connection. "You know," Frank said to Marina, "I've been thinking a lot about that afternoon, how one small gesture of yours changed our story so much." Marina smiled, leaning slightly on her broom. "It wasn't my gesture, Professor. It was just a reminder of something that already existed in each of you. Sometimes we just need someone to point out what's already there." And it was true. The capacity for empathy, for mutual recognition, for kindness, all of this already existed in those young people, in Frank, in every person who passed through that square daily. Marina had simply created the conditions for these qualities to manifest themselves. The story of Professor Frank and the encounter in the square spread through the community organically, not as a grand legend, but as a gentle reminder that small acts of awareness can create waves of change that extend far beyond the initial moment. Retired teachers in the region began to organize to create more intergenerational dialogue spaces. Young professionals became more actively involved in community initiatives. But perhaps the most lasting impact was on the way people began to inhabit their everyday spaces. The square, which was once just a place to pass through, became a true community gathering place. Spontaneous conversations between strangers became more common. Gestures of civility and mutual consideration multiplied. Frank, now 73, discovered that retirement wasn't the end of his career as an educator, but the beginning of an even richer new phase. At the book club, he not only shared knowledge, but constantly learned from the diverse perspectives of the participants. Literature became a bridge between generations, a common ground where experience and youth could meet as equals. Marina, finally recognized for her fundamental role in that transformation, was invited to speak at schools about the importance of community work and mutual respect. Her message was always simple but powerful. Every person has value. Every story deserves to be heard, and small gestures of acknowledgement can change lives. That Thursday afternoon, which had begun with an elderly man waiting alone for a job opportunity, had transformed into something much bigger, a symbol of how human dignity can be preserved and celebrated even in the most ordinary circumstances. There was no fanfare, no dramatic headlines, no caped heroes or grand gestures. There were just people acknowledging other people. There was just a moment where indifference was replaced by attention, neglect by care, invisibility by recognition, and that in itself was revolutionary, because in the end, it's these small, everyday revolutions that truly transform the world, not the grand pronouncements or spectacular gestures, but the quiet moments when we choose to see, hear, and value the humanity of those who share this brief moment on the planet with us. Frank's story reminds us that it's never too late to start a new chapter, that age is just a number when you have something valuable to offer. Marina's story teaches us that sometimes the most important role we can play is that of a facilitator of human connection, and the young people's story shows us that empathy and social awareness aren't fixed traits, but skills that can be developed at any time. Today, when you leave your house, when you cross a square, sit on a bench, wait in line, remember this story. Look around, see the people, really see them. Recognize the inherent dignity in every human being who crosses your path. And remember that you have the power to be someone's Marina, the person who creates the conditions for genuine connections to happen. Because stories like Frank's are happening all around us every day, waiting only for someone with eyes to see and a heart to act. And maybe, just maybe, the next story of silent transformation will begin with you.